Hi everybody, I'm Charlie Nowen. My claim to fame is that PJ Pofall is my wife, and she's sitting back there. Everybody knows PJ. Thank you all for being here for Jay Weiner and his book. I have read the book. I got it a couple weeks ago, and I hope you all either have already bought it or will buy it tonight, because it is really very interesting and a well-written book about the Franken Coleman election at the very end and the recount and contest that followed it. The reason I'm standing here is not just because I'm Jay's friend and PJ's husband, but I did have a role in the contest and in the recount, and I'll describe that for you for a couple of minutes. I'm a lawyer. I practice in Minneapolis at the Lockridge Grindle Nowen law firm, and I'm lucky to say that I'm a good friend since 7th grade of Dave Lillehaug, who is a former U.S. attorney, and many of you know was the primary lawyer for Senator Franken during the recount and contest. And on the night of the election, you probably all can go back there in your minds right now, or many of you can at least, because Obama was elected, and many of us were very excited about that. There was a positiveness, something new in the air in this country. And then we had our little Senate race, and it was Senator Norm Coleman against Al Franken. And unlike the presidential race in the state of Minnesota, which was a veritable landslide for Barack Obama, the Senate race was very close. And on the night of the election, I was at home watching the results, and I would email back and forth with Dave, who was working for the campaign. He's very active in a lot of political campaigns. And at 1:30 in the morning, he called me and said, "It's really close. I think there's going to be a recount, and I want you to be involved." And the main reason he wanted to be involved is because 2 years previously I had represented the St. Louis County auditor in a recount involving the county attorney's office up there. And that election, by the way, was flipped. The incumbent was ahead going into the recount, and the challenger won as a result of the recount. So things went ahead, and I got involved, and one of my areas of responsibility was St. Louis County in northern Minnesota in the recount, and I saw a lot of ballots, and you all saw a lot of ballots too, because they were on the Strib site, on the MinnPost site, and they were everywhere. You got to see the ballots that were being counted. And if any of you from Duluth or that part of the state, you know that a DFLer in St. Louis County is a DFLer. I mean, they feel labor, they feel farmer, and they feel Democrats. And my job as a lawyer was to represent the Franken campaign and make sure that all the ballots that were improper were noticed as such, so they weren't counted. Ultimately, they went to the canvassing board for counting, one way or the other, and to give advice on the Franken ballots too. And I got to tell you that every time I let any kind of question go through, many times like a stray pencil mark at the bottom, and one of the people who were part of that group for Franken would say, "Well, we should object to that," and I'd say, "No, we're not going to object to that." They would look at me like I was a Republican, and they would doubt me, and they would turn to one of my colleagues up there and see if they could convince him to talk me into objecting to a ballot. Flash forward to the contest, you all recall that as a result of the recount, it flipped from 215 vote margin for Senator Coleman to a 49 vote, I believe, and then ultimately with the absentee ballots, it went up to, I think, 224. And then the contest, the lawsuit began. And my role in the lawsuit was to represent individual voters. We petitioned the Supreme Court, and ultimately that became part of the contest. That was a 7-week trial. I didn't represent Franken. I didn't represent Coleman. But I represent individuals, like you all maybe. Some of you may be voted by absentee ballot, and there were many people whose absentee ballots were improperly not counted. And I had 61 people, clients, and they got to be known as the Now in 61. And ultimately, 47 of those 61 voters had their votes counted for Franken. And so, if you think about it, that's a substantial number in the context of this race. Now, the book tells all that in much greater detail and much more clarity. Let me talk about the press just for a moment. Obviously, I knew Jay. Our kids went to school together at grade school and Como Park High School. Ultimately, where our daughters graduated, Jay and Ann's sons graduated, and I knew him as one of the great sports writers, particularly expertise on stadium financing, and of course has been to each and every Olympics, winter and summer, since 1984. I guess it split sometime in the middle there, I don't really remember. But that was his area of expertise, and suddenly he was involved on behalf of MinnPost covering this election. And he became the person that everybody turned to for his analysis of what was going on a daily basis. And I bet many of you started reading MinnPost, at least more regularly than once in a while, because of Jay's reports. And I can report that from the beginning, before it all began, MinnPost had, say, under 500,000 hits per month on the internet. By the time Jay got going and the race really became a public matter, it was well over 1 million hits per month. And Jay got was it $1 for each increase? I talked to a lot of reporters during that time. My role was not as the chief lawyer for Franken. There was a lawyer from Washington, there was Dave Willahog from Minnesota, but rather representing individual voters. And I talked to a lot of reporters, and then I read their stories. And there were some good reporters, some weak reporters, but there was one analyst who really was head and shoulders above all others, and that was Jay Weiner. And we're very lucky that he devoted himself to this book. So welcome up here, and thank you, Jay.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Micawbers, and I see a lot of friends and neighbors here and who've witnessed my miraculous transformation from sports writer to a political pundit. And it's been a very short, strange trip. It's quick. I would like to really chat a little bit about how I actually got here, talking about a Recount book and about some of the surprises of the Recount, even though many of you followed it. I think there's some things that you might not know, I hope you don't know, that are written about. And I also know that the Recount had a tendency to create fatigue, boredom, and frustration. So in the midst of all of those three things, you might have forgotten a lot. It lasted 8 months, but for me now, 2 days ago would be the 23rd month that I've actually been thinking about it and writing about it, and hopefully I'll be thinking about it for a few more months as things, go on. But it's been really a 2-year project for me. So as Charlie said, when many of us last knew each other, I was a sports writer, and I did it for 27 years, and then the newspaper changed, and I took a buyout, and I was on the mean streets of St. Paul without a job. And within months, Joel Kramer, who was the editor and publisher of the Star Tribune, started MinnPost, which is kind of a fuddy-duddy, news website and newspaper online. And a bunch of us, started to work for him, and I more or less began doing for MinnPost what I had done for the Star Tribune, writing about off-the-field sports stuff. I covered the Olympics in China in 2008, and upon my return, the MinnPost editors wondered if I would dip my toe into some political reporting, mostly because sports is not MinnPost's highest priority. Don Heffenberg, one of our editors, is here, and he knows that. And so I wrote something about the state constitutional amendment on the arts and the outdoors. That was my first kind of political story, and it took me forever because I wasn't really quite sure if it was right, but it turned out fine. And then I wrote something about the Twin Cities African-American community's reaction to Barack Obama's victory. Those are my two political stories, and then I waited to see what was next. So soon after Election Day, Coleman and Franken were at 42% apiece, and I hadn't covered the campaign at all. I was away, it really didn't matter to me. Don and Roger Bowen, the editors, came to me and with another brilliant idea. They said, would you like to help out with the recount? And I really hadn't followed it. I said, sure, whatever. We all thought it would last for a couple of weeks. And Judge Riley was at an event this afternoon with Charlie at Charlie's law firm that I spoke to, and she thought it would last a couple of weeks too. So wrong. So it ended on July 7th when Franken was sworn in. And I was there for just about every event. I missed a few canvassing board meetings. I missed just one day of the trial. But I was at pretty much every news conference that happened. It was wild. But the idea of the book was not my idea, really. I didn't come here because it was my idea, but it came pretty early in December of 2008 where someone raised it to me. I had written a sort of impressionistic Hunter Thompson-ish story in MinnPost. It wasn't as good as Hunter Thompson, but it was pretty good. And it talked about the ebb and flow of the recount and about the lawyers and the news conferences and the wacky mistrust of both sides. And it got a lot of reaction, and in fact, all the lawyers on both sides enjoyed it in their own way. So it created a little bit of a vibe, and it was a new feel for the recount, because the newspapers, and I have newspaper friends here, but the newspapers were very serious about the recount. Not that I wasn't serious, but they were really serious about the recount. And there was a canvassing board meeting in early to mid-December, and it was that day when the lizard people and the flying spaghetti monsters were up, and Brett Favre got a vote, and I was sitting there. It was in one hearing room where all of the hearings had been. And I was probably checking my emails or doing something like that. And Eric Schultz, Franken's communications director, and really his spinmeister, approached me. And Eric was kind of pacing. And Eric is a 30-ish, good-looking, democratic zealot. He's out to, he tells the story in the book of his first lesson as a political operative of a man in New York who took a bat, literally took a baseball bat out and told all the young employees of a campaign, this is what we're going to do to the other guy. He took a baseball and he whacked it. That's Eric's mentality. He's a great guy, but he's really into it. And he's now the spokesman for the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and he was John Edwards' spokesman, so he's been around the block. And he came up to me and he said, "Gol darn it, Jay," he said, "what's with Minnesota? What's with all this process? How long is this going to take? You guys take forever here. This thing should be over." And so he was basically asking why democracy moves slowly here. And I said to him, "Eric, if your guy would have gotten 43 frickin%, we wouldn't be here. Come on, they got 42, you got 42. That's why we're here. We just do our best here." And then, I didn't know then, but I point out now that Bush v. Gore took 36 days and Franken v. Coleman took 35 weeks. So that's the big difference. I mean, there are other, that wasn't the only reason, but how Minnesotan can you get when you go 35 weeks instead of 36 days? So after I told him that, he said, "You should write this book." He pointed to me and said, "You should write this book." And I just saw Eric last week in Washington, and the story is true. The story is true. I said, "No, there's no money in books. I wrote a book 10 years ago. It wasn't very good. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything about election law. It's going to take forever." And he said, "You should write the book." So then time moved on. So December passed, January passed, and it was February. And we were now into a trial. And the trial started very tediously and very slowly. The judges provided us with a press room in the bottom of the Supreme Court building so we could check our laptops and check our phones. They didn't allow laptops or phones in the courtroom, obviously. And they had a closed-circuit TV there so we could watch the trial. And suddenly it was about February 15th, and I'm thinking, this thing is never going to end. So I might as well write a book. And I started to put together a book outline, and I dived into it, and I had an agent, and we pitched it in New York, and we had a great proposal. But the New York publishers said it was too regional of a story. The market was being flooded with Obama books. Or, if Al Franken would write it, they'd take it. So I said, I'm no Al Franken. People say, look, but I'm not. But somebody had to document this. So thankfully, the University of Minnesota Press saw the possibilities, and here I am. And right now, the chronicler, I guess, of the longest, largest, most expensive recount in U.S. History. So that's important. Still, as protracted as it was for people like Eric Schultz, it went pretty quickly. You know, if you think about it, the Supreme Court took a month, for instance, to decide a case, which Charlie knows and other lawyers know is lightning speed for the state's Supreme Court. And there were some surprises. There's some good. I think these are the three of the surprises that I think are important, or things that are counterintuitive. One was the kind of countervailing but common roles of the Supreme Court Chief Justice Art Magnuson, the Secretary of State Mark Ritchie, the Republican-appointed Supreme Court Justice by Tim Pawlenty, and Mark Ritchie, arguably the most liberal elected official in the state, I think, certainly an executive. And Magnuson had been the Chief Justice for only a couple of months when he was asked to be on the board. It usually lasts 10 minutes, it really does. I sat through the canvassing board meeting right after the primary election, this in August. It lasted 6 minutes. That's how long the canvassing board took. It's generally a rubber stamp. In fact, we counted by the seconds. In the story that I wrote, it said 360 seconds. That's how short it was. And the out-of-town Democratic lawyers like Mark Elias from Washington assumed that Minnesota would be like other states, like Florida, and its courts and agencies would be highly politicized. And so Elias and others assumed that Ritchie, this leftist, would cut a break for them if ever anything happened at the board. And Magnuson, they thought, would tilt towards Norm Coleman. The in-town Republican lawyers and Republican Party operatives just assumed that Justice Magnuson would lean their way because he was a Pawlenty appointee, he was a Supreme Court Justice, and that's the way they assumed it would be. Well, it wasn't true, and you know, this is not Florida. And Magnuson made a key decision at the canvassing board meeting, and I write about it in the book, in which he, after a number of meetings, even about a month's worth of meetings, after good arguments by the Franken side, decided that these previously rejected absentee ballots should be examined by elections officials statewide. And it was really a shocking change of heart by Eric Magnuson. And I write about the shock a little bit that one of the other canvassing board members had at that. It was excerpted in MinnPost last week. At the same time, Ritchie really was now being criticized by the Democrats for being too fair and for not having bent over backwards. So the whole thing was just good. It was actually quite good. You know, that both guys did their jobs. Another surprise that I actually learned in this back reporting, and that really wasn't written during the campaign, was the distance that the Obama campaign kept from Franken during the campaign. I didn't cover the campaign, and so I didn't know much about it, and I had to go back and do the reporting about the campaign. And it's pretty clear that the Obama campaign purposely stiff-armed the Franken campaign. I guess I really don't know why. If it was an aversion to Franken and sort of the baggage that he brought as a candidate, or more of a belief that Obama was going to win Minnesota anyway, so he didn't have to come here. But in the end, he never set foot in Minnesota during the campaign. Obama did not. And that hurt Franken in the Twin Cities and on the Iron Range in particular, where people really wanted to see Obama campaign. Hillary Clinton came to Duluth the night before the election, and you talked to people in the 8th Congressional District. That wasn't enough. And when you look at the results at the end of the election, there was a big, big drop-off for Franken in the 8th Congressional District versus Jim Oberstar and versus Obama. An hour at an airport in Minneapolis, an hour at the airport in Duluth, and we might not have had a recount had there been 2,000-3,000 more votes for Franken out of those areas. Jeff Blodgett, who's a neighbor, I don't know if Jeff's here tonight, but Jeff was the Obama campaign manager in the state, and he was very frustrated by that, and he tells me, and I write, that he went a little rogue at the end of the campaign and actually put together a door handle, you know, those things you get on your door handle at the end of the election, with Obama and Franken on the same piece of paper. The people in Chicago didn't find out, but that was kind of going rogue. Then the other surprise, another interesting niche, is Charlie's role. And it was reported, it was called the Nowen 61. I don't know if the people who followed it closely might have followed this group of people. But Charlie's role showed the length to which the Franken legal team was willing to go to hunt for valid votes that the Coleman side didn't participate in that same hunt. It's still inexplicable to me. They explain in the book that they didn't feel they had the money, they didn't have the resources, and maybe they didn't have the votes either, which is probably the truth. But the election contest was about to begin. So the contest is the trial. We're already beginning into January. Franken has won the recount, and he's won by 49. And Coleman is challenging that and going to court. And Franken's lead lawyer, Mark Elias, who's nervous about everything, was really nervous that Coleman's legal team would begin to search under every rock for individual voters who believed their votes had been turned down. We do have a law here in the state that individual voters can petition the Supreme Court and, in effect, bring their own election contests. So if Coleman was going to do that, Elias reasoned, then Franken had to do that too, because if Coleman was chasing votes, then we have to chase some more. And Elias and Franken's campaign manager, Stephanie Shriak, brought Charlie in. And in a sense, Charlie was playing defense, really, because he was trying to get as many votes as perhaps Coleman would get, because there was an assumption that Coleman was going to play offense. Sorry for the sports metaphors. And so this is this arduous task where you try to find the voters, you try to make sure they're following the law, they write these really clear affidavits, you make sure that what they did is within the four statutory reasons that a vote can be accepted or not, or turned down or not. And you have to thread needles on certain votes with the 3-judge panel. But the surprise was that the Coleman side didn't do that. They didn't do it at all. So while Charlie was out there trying to get votes in order to sort of catch up to Coleman, the Coleman team didn't embrace this tactic at all. So in the end, the defensive measure became an offensive kick butt for the Franken team. And when all was said and done, of those 61 voters who either Charlie and the Franken campaign found or the voters found them, 47 of those votes wound up being legal. All of them were counted. Presumably they were all Franken voters. I'm guessing they were. We didn't see the ballots, but I'm sure that they were. And so Franken wins by 312. And 15% of the votes that Franken wins by are Charlie Nowen's votes. And when the trial goes on and Franken picks up 87 votes, 47 of them are Nowen votes. So more than half of the votes that Franken wins at the trial, again, a trial that Norm Coleman wanted to have, are votes from the Nowen 61. Let me talk about the journalism a little bit too, because that's kind of what I do. And the UpTake is here tonight, by the way, the streaming UpTake. And so it's actually an honor for me to be on the UpTake. In the book, I call them the psychedelic C-SPAN, is what I call them. And when I said that at some other event, I got all sorts of emails from UpTake people saying, yes. And also the C-SPAN of and by the people. The UpTake was really important to the spreading, I guess, and the knowledge of the recount. And the world could watch the recount because of the UpTake. And I'm guessing a lot of you people saw it streamed on the web. Not only did we see the trial, but every afternoon, after a day's activities in court, and then every lunchtime, when there was a break, the two spokespeople for each side, Mark Elias for the Franken team and Ben Ginsberg for the Coleman team, would talk to us, Minnesota reporters, which as time wore on, was really a small group of people. People think this was a national story. On a given Wednesday in February, when it was cold outside, there were maybe 6 or 7 of us who were covering this recount at the most. You know, the TVs would come in towards the end of the week when it looked like there might be some crescendo occurring. But Ginsberg and Elias weren't only talking to us, but they were also talking to the stream of the UpTake, because the UpTake was going to law offices, potential donors, political operatives, all around the U.S., particularly in Washington. And they took those moments in front of the UpTake's cameras pretty seriously, even if it meant 100 people were watching or 1,000. And when the Franken legal team was finalizing this gigantic spreadsheet at the end of the trial that I write about, that was called Mark's Big Idea, which was a 19 8-column spreadsheet that tried to prove or disprove all the votes that the Coleman team tried to introduce. And Franken side said Coleman only proved 9 votes of all the votes that he brought in. They had to go to the UpTake's archives online, and they had staff people or volunteers watch every trial moment to make sure that the notes of the lawyers in the courtroom, because the transcripts didn't exist yet for the trial, that the notes of their lawyers and of their clerks matched what the UpTake had shown. So the UpTake became a resource of great power. And then there were the other cases where lawyers in the law firms were watching the trial and would IM lawyers in the courtroom and give them ideas or tell them they had forgotten something or missed something, and that also was the power of the UpTake. So I think it's kind of cool that the UpTake is here. And just briefly, it's 2010 now, and a lot of people in journalism are doing tweeting and blogging, but things have changed so quickly that in 2008 it's fair to say that this was the first full 24-hour reported recount, and certainly even the entire race was. I would cover news conferences, write stories on my iPhone, send them to MinnPost. They would be posted, and before I got home, and Franken's headquarters, or Coleman's headquarters, were about a mile. One was right near the Egg and I, and one was near the Amtrak station. It had been sent through the echo chamber and was at Google News by the time I got home. And if you got lucky enough to get picked up by Huffington or Salon or Politico, it was crazy. I got emails from people wanting me to send my MinnPost story from tomorrow's newspaper. I said, we're not a newspaper. So the whole journalism world flattened out, during this period. Also to the extent that people like Elias and Ginsburg treated us as if we were the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press, because it doesn't matter how many people you reach, it's who you've reached. So in the end, here's what I think the recount has come to mean. And I was just in Washington last week doing one of these things, and I heard a lot about recounts. We've got 6 U.S. Senate races that are up for grabs right now that are hard to call, including Harry Reid's in Nevada. And there are 30 House seats that even all the pundits, like RealPolitics.com and Nate Silver, are saying are still up for grabs. So that's 30. And there's going to be a recount. Maybe there'll be 1, perhaps 3. Most recounts don't flip elections. Most recounts don't last this long. Most recounts get resolved real quickly. But just like the Franken effort in 2008, one of the chambers, the Senate or the House, probably the Senate, could be at stake. Not the 60th vote now, but maybe the 50th vote. And the Democrats learned from Bush v. Gore in Florida that they needed to be more aggressive. And that's what we saw here in Minnesota with Gore, with Franken and Coleman. And they brought that vengeance really to the recount, which is where the GOP discovered that they need to be more prepared, more data-focused, more creative, more exacting in the work that they do. So the next time that there's a recount, and the next time is now, is really going to be a doozy, I think, because I think that the Democrats have got the template down, assuming they have the money. This recount cost $20 million combined. And the Republicans are not going to, their battle cry is going to be, not again. So I'm guessing that in the wee hours of election night, Charlie's going to get some phone calls, and Mark Elias is going to get some phone calls, and some other saga will play out. Thanks for coming, and we'll answer your questions if you have some questions. Yes?
I'm rather surprised that Ben Ginsburg was so ill-prepared, given that he was the big face in the Bush v. Gore recount. Why were they kind of out of it?
Well, a bunch of the Franken lawyers were at this shindig where I was last week, and we're still asking that question, and I write a bit about it because everybody in the recount, every key player in the recount spoke to me, except for Senator Coleman and Ben Ginsburg. So I wasn't able to talk to Ginsburg and ask him why it looked like he didn't do the kind of job that he's known to do. Some people think he came into the process semi-late, but others say he did not, and he was Coleman's lawyer. Others felt that the Coleman side really wanted to be local, and felt that to be local was going to be important before the canvassing board, but Franken was local before the canvassing board too. Elias didn't say much to the canvassing board at all. Dave Lillehog was really sort of the lead there. Maybe he knew after the recount, the first recount at 49, that Coleman wasn't going to win. And he really did go back to the old playbook of the equal protection playbook of Bush v. Gore, which really didn't exist here. So the answer is, I don't know yet either, but people continue to wonder, why didn't Ginsburg, why didn't the Republicans do a better job? Now, one answer is that Senator Coleman was also deeply involved in choosing people, particularly Joe Friedberg in the trial. And I don't think there's anyone who believes, even though Friedberg is a great lawyer, that that was the right choice. And you'll see in the book, I write about exactly how he was hired, and Friedberg was hired 3 days before the first real hearing of the trial, when they scheduled the trial. So he was hired on January 13th. The first meeting was January 16th. And he was going to be the lead trial lawyer for Norm Coleman. It was their trial. He had to put the trial on. Kevin Hamilton, who was sort of the lead lawyer for Franken, was on the ground on November 11th, and always thinking what happens if the trial happens. So Kevin had about a 2.5-month head start on that. But your question is a good one. It's sort of unresolved. Done.
Jay, can you talk a bit more about the money and how important that was? Beyond the legal team, you have this whole fundraising operation.
Well, you guys didn't pay me much at all. What money, Don? Well, it was really important. Franken's team spent significantly more than Coleman's team, really. Of that $20 million, Franken, I think, I just reread that today, spends about $13 million, and Coleman about $7 million.
Was that 20 million on top of the 40 million
Yes.
of the campaign?
Yes.
So it's 60 million total.
60 million. So in that period of time between November 4 and July 7, they spend $20 million, and that is not all lawyers' fees. In the Coleman's case, it's more than half of his total outlay was lawyers. In Franken's case, it was about half, because Franken had all these data people. And had people doing all these algorithms on their absentee ballots, etc. So money, well, A, money was critical to keep it going, and B, that's why the messaging was so important. And I write here about this one Star Tribune story that appeared on November 30th, in which the Star Tribune said, with some really cockamamie chart that I write about, that Franken couldn't win, that it was impossible for Al Franken to win based on how they were looking at the tracking of the votes. And the Franken people went berserk, because with this 24-hour web thing, people in California, New York are looking at their web saying, the Minneapolis Star Tribune says Al Franken can't win. Why should I give him money? And it's at that point that the Franken team begins to say at news conferences, we're down by 24, we're down by 5, we're down by 3, and the reporters are saying, what's with you guys? How can that be that you know that? And then, since you've asked, one of the most dramatic moments really is when a big snowstorm here on a Saturday, Mark Elias comes out at a news conference and says, I guarantee you we're going to win by between 35 and 50 votes. There are only 2 reporters there, because it was Roberta Stassenberger, who's now with the Star Tribune, and myself. And I don't know if the Star Tribune really did much, or the wires didn't do much. Nobody believed him. Then 5 days later, they won by 49. And that's when we started to believe Mark Elias, that he had his numbers down. And so that's why Franken had a very now accomplished data guy working on all these absentee ballots coming in. And they had PDF files of every envelope, and then they would tag each envelope. And so when it went before the canvassing board, if there was a mustard stain over here, they could push a button and call up all the mustard stain ballots. And they also had a Pony Express in which they brought all these ballots back in real time as fast as they could. Coleman just didn't employ the kind of rapid response. So the money was really important, and I think everybody's paid their bills. Critical.
This was like a sports season, from when it started to when it finished. Did it feel like almost like covering a sports event in a sense? You had 2 sides. There was going forward and going backwards. I mean, it had to be. You didn't know what the conclusion was going to be. How did that feel during the time you were covering it?
It felt just like a sports event. And particularly, and I hadn't covered it like as team beat for like 20 years. But it was just like covering the Twins to a certain extent, because the same, when you cover a baseball team, not all 25 guys talk to you, but maybe 7 or 8 people talk to you, and then you have to go to the other 13 every once in a while. But there's 7 or 8 core people who will talk to you all the time, or you'll sit next to them in those days when you could fly on the airplane and that kind of stuff. And it was the same way in this, like the law clerks didn't talk to me, or the judges didn't talk to me, but certain lawyers did, and certain lawyers who weren't supposed to talk to me talked to me. And then you'd write something just like in sports, and you have to come back the next day. So and people were reading every word. They really were. I would find out later the judges were reading every word, and so you had to show up every day. And so it felt like sports in that way. It was a little, well, some of the days felt like old Twins Oakland A's games in 1982 in August on a Thursday. They were really boring. But yeah, I don't think it was much different at all. And as now somebody who sits in a lot of political news conferences, I find them to be way too confrontational. I think that they're always. I wish someone were here to dispute it, but they just seem. Everybody's in a sort of gotcha mode. You said this yesterday, and why are you saying this today? And maybe it's that way in people covering sports these days too. But I felt this was really more like sports because there was so much downtime, and they'd come out of the courtroom, and it was like batting practice or something like that, and it was. Then Charlie would tell me everything. Dave.
During the trial and this period of time, was there somebody that you were reading who you thought was covering things well?
There was, well, I thought that Rachel Stassenberger, who was then at Pioneer Press, did a good job. I really did. The Star Tribune used too many people. And so there were, sometimes a guy would cover it in the morning, there'd be a different guy in the afternoon. It was during this period of time where people, I think, had to take days off too, and that happened at the Pioneer Press because this is 2008 and the papers were really in cutback mode. But I thought that Rachel did a really good job and worked her rear end off. So I thought she did well. There was this really relatively nutty guy for a website called Talking Points Memo.
Yeah.
His name is Eric Kleefeld.
Yeah.
And he wasn't there. He was reading me or watching the UpTake, and he got on all the conference calls. There were conference calls regularly for the national media. And I thought that Eric did a good job too. If you read him and you didn't live here, you would have been up to date. It's a left-leaning website. Then the Powerline blog here, the conservative blog, was interesting to read because they were taking very critical shots at the Coleman team, even though they were Republican-leaning. They were very critical of some of the decisions. They're lawyers who write that blog. So I would check those.
What about Nate Silver's statistical
Well,
analysis?
Nate Silver's stuff I looked at off and on, but I didn't follow it that much, and perhaps I should have. I don't know that did he wind up being right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I didn't follow it. I've started to read him now to see which recounts are about to happen now, because I want recounts to happen big time.
If Coleman had more money and better lawyers, could he have won?
In my opinion, I don't think so. I don't think the votes were there. However, they might have made decisions earlier on that would have dropped the election more into suspicion. And we talked about this afternoon at this lawyers' function. Franken wins by 49 on the real recount. And I write about this too. If the Coleman side would have been more thoughtful in attempting to block the counting of absentee ballots, and they had the opportunity to do it, the trial could have started with 49 votes different rather than 225. And the judges have told me that 49 is a lot slimmer margin than 225. And so if you're a judge coming into a trial, you think, well, what does it really take to flip a 49-vote election? It takes a half a vote a county. That's all it is. You just need one vote in every other county, and suddenly you're tied. 225 is really harder to say, okay, Mr. Coleman, show me. And they said that to him, actually. They did say to him, and that's why the now in 61 became so effective, because Coleman didn't show him, but Franken did. So I think that's the one major decision pre-trial that could have altered stuff. But, you know, the votes are sort of what the votes are, and you know, to me, he won by 312. I heard people like Nate Silver say they should flip a coin on the election, that it was a virtual tie, and I don't believe that. I don't agree with that.
You mentioned Coleman's involvement in at least selecting lawyers.
Yeah.
I don't know if that also involves strategy. What about Franken's involvement?
He was briefed pretty much every night, either in person or by phone. And he made, and Charlie would know better than this, but he probably can't talk about it, he made virtually no decisions. He made one big decision in January, but the Franken effort was a delegated effort. He delegated to Shriok, the campaign manager. She delegated to Elias, the lawyer. Elias delegated to the other people in the team. Or at least that's the way that I understand it. The one thing that Franken said no to was Elias had this antsiness about him that after the canvassing board said he had won by 49, that he should be seated in the Senate. And Elias goes to Franken, and I write about it soon afterwards, and says, I want to get you seated in the Senate, let's go. And Franken says, that, you know, I'm going to want to run again one day. It hasn't played itself out. He had good instincts. He said no, and as far as I've been told, that's the one big thing that he says no to. Now, about 2 weeks later, Coleman sues and wants to have the trial. And Elias goes back to Franken and says, well, now, who knows how long this is going to take? And people in Washington are actually saying, let's get Franken here. The first day of the trial, Harry Reid has a news conference and says, I want Franken here. And then Elias then sues and goes to the Supreme Court in an attempt to get Franken his certificate early, and he gets smashed in the Minnesota Supreme Court. So Franken's instincts are actually pretty good, and that was probably Elias's lowest moment as a lawyer during the thing. Not that it mattered to him, but it didn't turn out well. So that's my understanding, you know, of how it went. But he was, I know that the lawyers were at his house a lot, and he was, you know, he's got this condo in downtown Minneapolis. And they were either on conference calls or meeting with him every day. Steve.
So as an outsider to the legal system, having sat through 7 months of this, what's your view of the legal system?
Really nice suits. Well, I mean, I was pretty lucky. There are a lot of good lawyers. And you know, I didn't see, you know, these guys were, without a discount, are $700–800 an hour lawyers, and you know, the records show they were making about the Perkins people were making $512 an hour. And Kevin Hamilton, who was the trial lawyer, David Lillaha, Mark Elias, these guys are really good. Joe Friedberg is good in his own world. That wasn't his world. I thought that it could have gone a little faster, you know, but the judges early on they acknowledged were deer in the headlights themselves. These judges had never seen an election law in their life, the three who were picked. You know, maybe I'm a Pollyanna or something. I thought the system worked. I thought it went fine. They certainly gave everybody a chance. Elias says that in Virginia you get 2 weeks for a death penalty case, and in Minnesota you get 8 months for a recount. He didn't quite get that. So I was okay with it. You know, I thought it was fine. You know, these judges were thoughtfully picked. Also, Riley, Marvin, and Hayden were known in judges' circles. Marvin from Thief River Falls, not so much, but Hayden and Riley are relatively distinguished and active women lawyers in the state. Hayden's one of the most senior women judges in the state, the chief judge in Stearns County, a Democrat, and so the Supreme Court just didn't pick these names out of the hat either. So it was pretty good judging. I thought it was far too collegial, frankly. I mean, I was surprised. I don't get how these guys can be fighting over the 60th seat in the Senate and then sort of shake hands with each other. I don't get that.
All right.
John.
I was going to ask Charlie if he'd talk a little bit about the landscape coming into it. I mean, you had some experience with recounts, but did you immediately pursue? I mean, obviously this was a little bit higher stakes, but coming into it, did you have some sense that it was going to be as involved? I mean, the camp was getting set up; it was pretty intense, or did it not seem that much?
Before I answer that, I should say that Judge Hayden, in kind of a local flavor, is married to Charlie Flint, who was a neighbor here for many years over on Hillside, I think. You know, I knew almost immediately it was going to be a really very detail-oriented, and it was going to go long and hard. And I think when I went to the first part of the recount, the lawyers for Coleman, my adversaries, who I grew quite fond of, they're really good lawyers and good, good guys, were very high-level lawyers from all across the country, and they knew their election law, and it was clear that every ballot was a battle, no question about it. Every single time we looked at a ballot, we were battling, you know, in a collegial way, in a courteous way, but in a very serious way with the Coleman legal team. So, you know, I mean, I didn't anticipate how long it was going to go. Man, no way. And I didn't anticipate that the trial would last 7 weeks. If I were a trial judge, I would not have let it go 7 weeks. I mean, it really did go too long, and I agree with Jay on that. But all that said, you knew it was going to be really a very detail-oriented kind of case, and that's what it turned out to be. And that's, I think, where Franken and his lawyers had an advantage. They stuck with the specifics, with the details. You know, you go to court, it's all about facts. And Franken lawyers were steeped in the facts, and the Coleman lawyers talked in more broad terms, and that didn't sell with that three-judge panel.
With Charlie, was there a common denominator among those 47 ballots that you were able to capture, or you know, as that made them become contestable and made them something that you could eventually prevail with?
You know, they yes, they all complied with very exacting state law for counting their ballots. I must say that there's some in the 14 that weren't counted that I still lose a little sleep over, even though Franken won. But the name plaintiff, the first named plaintiff in my petition, is a fellow by the name of Dennis Peterson from St. Louis County. He did everything right. He went to the auditor's office. He had everything done there, and he signed in. He was witnessed by an assistant auditor. When the label was put on the outer envelope, instead of writing his name and address, he didn't have anything to do with that. The auditor put on a sticky that had his number, you know, 6-digit or whatever it was, 8-digit number that tracks all of us voters in the Secretary of State system. And it tracked his name exactly, and it tracked his address. And because, however, the law says you have to have a name and address on that outer envelope, his vote was never counted. And I battled that to the very end because I thought he relied on the auditor to do it right. And it literally lined up exactly, hadn't moved, his name was not misspelled, and it lined up exactly. But on the 47 that did get counted, I mean, they were all just like us. I mean, they all did it right. Some didn't want to stand in lines because everybody was worried about the lines. Remember that in the 2008 election? So a lot of people said, I'm going to get an absentee ballot and just avoid standing in lines. And there were people who were out of town, and there were people who, just normal reasons, just folks. And they did things the way they thought it was supposed to be done, many times with the advice of people at the local level. And they really wanted their votes counted. I mean, I never had clients who were more intent on winning, but it wasn't just Franken. It was they wanted their votes counted. They particularly wanted their votes counted because it was such a historic election. They wanted to tell their kids and grandkids they voted for Obama. That was part of it too. David.
How did they find out that their votes hadn't been counted? What was the...
You can find some of them got letters. You can find that out. You can track them. Is what it boils down to.
So they had bothered to check, though.
That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is that each side would get the got eventually through data practice requests got the list, the names, and they were able to contact people and say, hey, your vote was not counted.
Well, and one of the results of the recount is that the law has changed, and now the Secretary of State's office has a website, and when you vote absentee, a couple other things have changed. There's no signature matches anymore, so that was one of the controversies during the recount. It's a number that you have, a code number, and now you can go to the website, check your code number, and see if your vote has counted. And they can also send emails if your vote has been turned down. So the system has, Mark Ritchie and others had wanted to change this beforehand. Valenti did veto some of these reforms until this past session in 2010. And so it's tightened up a bit so that people do know, can know better and faster.
Joan Groh was in our offices earlier today. We were talking about this, and she said that 20 years ago or whatever it was when she was secretary, she was working on some of these changes, and it's taken until today basically to have the changes made. Yes.
Question for Jay. Did this recount maintain or enhance Minnesota's reputation for good government, or did the Wall Street Journal view that this was a tainted recount, stolen from Coleman prevail in a national sense?
I think it cut both ways. I don't think there was a Wall Street. This is a guess, obviously, because I haven't interviewed everybody, but I think a lot of people thought that Minnesota was a little bit of a laughingstock because of how long it took. The jokes on Jay Leno or Letterman, because the Afghanistan recount was happening at the same time. They'd say, the Afghanistan recount's going, we think Franken's ahead. So I think there was that kind of humor about it. The Wall Street Journal editorials were pretty singular, really, in their attacks. And Judge Cleary in St. Paul, who was on the canvassing board, wrote to the Journal early on during the canvassing board phase and just took a big whack at them. And he got good reaction to that. The Pioneer Press, I think, reprinted that whole exchange. So to answer your question, I think that in general, frankly in general, most people didn't really pay that much attention. It was noise going on. Obama, even political people didn't pay that much attention. Obama's administration was forming. Then the Senate was coming together. Healthcare was being started. And this was all going on while we here are still waiting. The question is whether here in the state, our own self-feeling about how the system worked was good in the end. And I think, generally speaking, I think people feel good about it. But I know there are Republican operatives and others who feel it was stolen. And so I don't know what percentage of people that would be. Judge Hayden, who I finally had a chance to have lunch with 2 weeks ago, now that she's not a judge anymore, said that in St. Cloud she has gone to the supermarket and people have walked up to her and said, I voted for Coleman. I really wanted him to win. I think you did a good job. So she feels, now these are nice people from St. Cloud. So I think I don't think it's a black or white if people think Minnesota did fine or didn't. I think there's definitely doubt in some people's minds when somebody only wins by 312 votes. I don't know if that answers it. Carol.
You talked a lot about the role of the campaign's lawyers in the litigation, but there are a lot of volunteers, citizens, but also lawyers who came out as in the early stage of the recount. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that worked or didn't work, or you know, you always wonder doing that, is it worth coming out to do those things?
I think it worked well. I mean, everybody was lawyered up, so to speak, and I think it resulted in people being allowed to vote. And I think people felt comfortable that they were going to get in. Polls would stay open, and that was, kind of thing was happening. The volunteer lawyers were crucial for the effort. There were a lot of volunteer lawyers who worked alongside me, for example, up in northern Minnesota at the various counties. It's not all St. Louis County up there, you know. There's Cass County and Crow Wing County. There's other counties, and of course the non-lawyer volunteers. Many of them were more knowledgeable about election law than I was. And, you know, they're very avid and rabid people who really know their election law. And so early on, people were telling me about statutory provisions. Didn't come across yet. So you know, that was a crucial part of the effort, really on both sides, but. You remember that time too on the DFL side. There was no shortage. In fact, some volunteers had to be turned away. There were just any number of people who were willing to spend night and day helping out the effort.
Where's Tom? So Tom, what happens next?
You sign books.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks very much.